Today I'll be showing you how to make 3 flavors of buttercream: salted caramel, chocolate, and Nutella. I'll be adding this to my Swiss meringue buttercream, but you can add this to any buttercream that you're comfortable with, such as American or really any of the European buttercreams. So let's make some Swiss meringue buttercream first. If you already know how, feel free to skip to the flavoring sections that are listed below in the timestamps in the description box. So the first thing is to set up your water bath. That's what you see on the left. I have a strainer that I put on top of the water bath because my bowl sits really nicely on top of it, but if your bowl sits on top of your pot without touching the water, then you don't need it. And the first thing we have to do is make our meringue. So this is the bowl of my stand mixer, and I'm separating the yolks from the egg white. Now you may notice I'm using a different amount of ingredients than what is written below the video. That's because I'm making all 3 batches at once. The ingredient amounts that I've written for you is going to yield about 3 cups of frosting when you're all said and done. If you ever need a different amount, go to my cake calculator, my calculator on my website. It'll calculate a frosting recipe based on your cake size. So you just have to be really careful with this part not to get any of the yolk in the egg white because it contains fat, and fat disrupts the structure of the meringue. Essentially, it won't whip up. So if you're not so careful with this part, what you can do is crack your egg whites individually into a bowl once you make sure that there's no yolk in that bowl, and then pour it into that big bowl. Then add your granulated sugar, and I am using a scale beneath me. I'm not just pouring in some random amount of sugar. I bake primarily by weight, but I'll provide the volume measurements as well. Then add in your cream of tartar. So cream of tartar is a form of acid. It's actually tartaric acid, and it denatures or unwinds the egg white proteins so that we can rebuild them back up into the meringue. Now grab a spatula and just stir it all together. Notice how it's kind of white in color. It's going to be super viscous. Once everything's kind of all mixed together, place it on top of your water bath. Just make sure that the steam is gently rising from the water bath, and that means that it's ready for you to put the bowl on top. Cooking anything over a steam bath like this just ensures that we heat it up very gently and not cook the egg whites to the point where they're solid. Use a spatula to scrape the sides of the bowl and the bottom just to evenly distribute the heat, and continue doing this until you reach a temperature of about 165 degrees Fahrenheit. The exact time is going to vary on the amount of steam that's rising up from your water bath to the amount of egg whites that you're using to the temperature of the egg whites. And that's why we use a thermometer. So once you hit 165 degrees Fahrenheit, it's pretty much safe to use, and you've killed off all of the potentially harmful bacteria that might be present in your egg whites. Then remove the bowl from your heat and use the whisk attachment and beat this on high speed for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, it should look like this: beautiful, fluffy, super white, and when you pull the whisk up, it'll form a stiff peak. At this point, the meringue will still be quite warm. You can see that mine is still registering at 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this doesn't have to be precise, but you do want the meringue and the butter to kind of be at room temperature, and this is way too hot. So I'm gonna let this rest for about 10 minutes, and we'll add the butter at that point. Once you are ready to add the butter, switch over to the paddle attachment. We're done with the whisk. We don't want to incorporate any air. We want to smooth everything out, and that's what the paddle attachment does. And you can kind of feel the bowl. It probably still feels a little bit warm still, but not hot, and that's just fine. We just don't want it to be super hot when we add in the butter. Now we're going to add the butter 1 chunk at a time. It doesn't matter about the size of the chunks as long as they are cut into chunks and as long as you add them slowly. After you start adding in the butter, you'll see the volume of the meringue decrease. That's because fat kind of disrupts air bubbles, and so all of that air that we incorporated into the meringue is kind of popping out, and that causes the meringue to sink down. That's totally normal and a part of this process. After you add in all the butter, mix for another 2 to 3 minutes on low speed. And at that point, one of 3 things will happen. If you got the temperature correct for both the butter and the meringue, meaning they were both at room temperature, the buttercream will come together or it'll emulsify if desired. The second thing that you might see is if your buttercream looks curdled or broken or separated, just has these little lumps of butter everywhere, that meant that the butter was too cold and we'll have to warm it up. So you can either wait. Eventually the butter will reach a temperature like room temperature and will come together, or you can use some sort of heating method like me. I take a hairdryer on low setting and heat the side of the bowl, and that seems to melt the butter just enough to bring everything together. The third thing that you might see is if everything just looks incredibly soupy. You don't see any curds or anything like that, but just really runny and soupy. That meant that the butter was too warm, and in that case, just just take the whole bowl with the paddle attachment, stick it in the fridge for another 15 minutes, bring it back out and re-whip it, and it should come together. Okay, first up is the caramel buttercream. So to a small saucepan, add your granulated sugar and lemon juice. And then just go in with your hands and rub the lemon juice into the sugar. The lemon juice serves as an acid to prevent the crystallization of the caramel sauce. Crystallization is when a sugar kind of builds up over the top and sides of the pan, and it essentially kind of ruins your caramel sauce. You can't really cook it from that point on. So this prevents that from happening. Turn your heat on to medium-low, then grab a heat-proof spatula and start stirring the sugar around. And we'll know this is done just by judging by the color. So we're just gonna keep stirring this until it's all melted and then wait for it to turn a kind of amber color. For me, this process took about 8 to 9 minutes, and I could have stopped here. I went a little bit further. The thing is that you don't want to get your caramel too dark, because then it's going to get hard and it's going to be harder for you to mix in the caramel on the butter. And then once you reach your desired color, take your pan off of the heat source. Slowly pour in your heavy cream, and you're going to see the caramel bubble up and steam. There's a big temperature difference, even if you use room temperature cream, between the cream and the caramel, because it's so hot. All of the water from the cream is essentially going to evaporate and leave behind the fat. But see how I almost cooked my caramel too much? There's that blob in the middle that's getting really hard to distribute with the cream. So if I had cooked it just a little bit longer, I think it would have been really difficult to add these last two ingredients. Then add in your unsalted butter and salt to taste. And I apologize, I forgot to do this on camera. I'm such a ding dong. But you add in the salt when the caramel has cooled down. That leaves the crystals intact, so they're nice and crunchy in the caramel sauce. Now before using, you have to let it cool completely. Definitely before putting into buttercream. It's much too hot and it'll probably melt it upon contact. So once it cools, then you just drizzle it into the buttercream while you're smoothing it out. So you definitely want to smooth out your Swiss meringue buttercream before frosting a cake or piping it. And during that step is usually when I flavor the buttercream. So go ahead and add all of that caramel sauce in. And if you find that your buttercream needs a little bit more of like something, usually it's salt for me. I'll add a pinch of salt, and that'll bring out the flavoring a little bit more. All right, so for the chocolate buttercream, we'll need to chop up and melt some chocolate. I really like this Trader Joe's dark chocolate. I find that the quality is good for the price, and I do tend to gravitate towards dark chocolates for buttercream. I think buttercreams already are very sweet, and so I'm trying to find a type of chocolate that brings a chocolate flavor forward instead of sweetness, and so the darker ones tend to do that for me. A good rule of thumb for me is about 1 ounce of chocolate per 1 cup of prepared frosting. So add all of your chopped chocolate to a microwave safe bowl and melt that on high power on 30-second intervals, stirring between every heating step. Once that's cooled, and I let mine sit for about 5 minutes before adding to this buttercream, you just pour it all in and let it smooth out into the buttercream. The resulting chocolate buttercream is not too sweet. It's got a deep, dark chocolate flavor with a medium color. And last up, we have Nutella buttercream, which is probably the easiest of the three to make because all you have to do is go out and buy a jar of Nutella. Although it is not for the faint of heart because Nutella is already sweetened and this buttercream is already sweetened. And so when we combine them, we're gonna get a super sweet buttercream. But it still tastes really good. You still get undertones of the hazelnut from the Nutella, a pretty milky chocolate flavor, and then an overall kind of like sweetness from the sugars.